In just 48 hours, Africa's power map tilted overnight. Public speeches praised unity and sovereignty, yet behind closed doors agreements were signed that quietly reassigned influence, resources, and leverage across regions observers thought were stable for decades without public debate. Why does this shift matter to anyone following Ibrahim Traore and the signals emerging from Burkina Faso's rapidly changing geopolitical position today this week? Because what happened next did not just surprise analysts. It forced governments to rethink assumptions they considered untouchable across continents simultaneously in real time. You are about to hear an explanation most public discussions avoid because it reveals mechanisms usually left outside official statements and press briefings. You will gain a clearer lens to read power shifts early. If someone stops at headlines alone, the sequence can look like routine diplomacy: another meeting, another declaration, another promise. Yet missing what sits beneath those gestures often leads observers to misjudge direction, timing, and intent. Without the deeper layer, it becomes easy to mistake coordinated strategy for coincidence, or to assume stability where structural change is already underway. Many who overlook such transitions only realize their significance after consequences become visible in markets, alliances, and regional influence balances. By then, interpretation turns into reaction instead of foresight. And reaction is always slower than reality. Those who follow carefully, however, begin to see patterns forming before they are publicly acknowledged. What many suspected quietly is true: the shift did not begin this week. It began months earlier. Within roughly 2 years, the number of Sahel-focused security and economic arrangements discussed among regional actors multiplied by more than 1/3, signaling preparation rather than improvisation. That single figure matters because it changes the narrative frame. Instead of a sudden disruption, the situation resembles a staged progression. The starting point traces back to a moment when regional leaders began questioning long-standing external security dependencies. Decisions started aligning new bilateral talks, revised resource contracts, and alternative logistics corridors discussed outside traditional diplomatic spotlights. None of these moves alone looked dramatic. Together, they formed a pattern. Ibrahim Traore entered this evolving landscape at a time when public frustration across parts of the Sahel was already rising. That timing is critical. It meant reactions to his policies were shaped not only by his own decisions, but by accumulated expectations that predated him. Early effects appeared first among groups closest to state systems: civil administrators adjusting procedures, local contractors renegotiating terms, and regional intermediaries recalibrating alliances. Each adjustment was small. When synchronized, often indicates structural motion rather than noise. One brief example illustrates this acceleration. A regional logistics broker reported that within a single quarter, inquiries about alternative trade routes doubled compared to the previous period. That kind of change rarely comes from rumor alone. It usually reflects actors preparing for real policy shifts. Taken together, these signals suggest something larger than a news cycle. They point to a process already underway, one that observers only began to notice once its outward signs crossed a visible threshold. And that realization reframes the central question: not whether change is happening, but how far it has already progressed beyond public awareness. Among the figures frequently cited by analysts tracking these developments, one name appears repeatedly as a reference point rather than just a participant: Ibrahim Traore. His role is often discussed not simply in terms of decisions made, but in how those decisions are interpreted by observers trying to map direction across the Sahel. That distinction matters because influence in geopolitical environments is measured as much by perception as by policy. One early account from a regional policy observer described attending a closed briefing where shifts in tone were more revealing than the official agenda. According to that account, the most striking change was not what was announced, but what was no longer emphasized. Long-standing talking points about external partnerships were shortened, while language about internal capacity appeared more frequently. The meeting ended without dramatic declarations, yet participants reportedly left with the shared impression that priorities had subtly rotated. Another example reinforces that this was not an isolated interpretation. A trade analyst monitoring cross-border activity noted that within weeks of those rhetorical adjustments, several mid-level commercial actors began revising risk projections tied to West African corridors. Their recalculations reflected expectation rather than instruction, suggesting that signals were being read even before formal policy shifts materialized. Moments like these are why certain observers treat Ibrahim Traoré less as a headline figure and more as a barometer. They watch reactions to him to gauge broader regional sentiment. When responses intensify, they infer pressure building elsewhere. When reactions quiet, they assume negotiations may be underway out of view. From that point forward, the situation no longer looked like a sequence of unrelated developments. It began to resemble a coordinated phase in a longer process. Signals were scattered. After it, they aligned. At first, a statement, brief, firm. Observers noted the tone, regional desks flagged it. Analysts circulated summaries overnight. Interpreted, reinterpreted. Within hours, commentary spread across policy circles. No escalation yet. Then movement. Delegations requested meetings. Advisors drafted language. Ministries cross-checked prior agreements. A second statement surfaced, shorter, sharper. That changed the tempo. Media panels reacted. Markets watched quietly. Diplomatic channels accelerated. Next came compression. Calls stacked. Briefings overlapped. Responses shortened. Officials avoided specifics. Silence replaced detail. Because silence in diplomacy often signals negotiation in progress. Pressure followed. Regional actors issued carefully worded remarks, not criticism, not endorsement, positioning. Each phrase calibrated, each pause intentional. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré's remarks continued circulating. Now cited alongside broader Sahel developments rather than treated as isolated commentary. Reactions multiplied. Commentators speculated. Analysts compared timelines. Governments requested clarifications through back channels, none announced publicly. Yet scheduling patterns told their own story. Meetings rearranged, visits postponed, delegations reshuffled. Then the turning point. Not loud, not dramatic, but decisive. A previously routine diplomatic exchange was suddenly described as strategic. That single word altered interpretation. After that moment, the pace slowed again, statements lengthened, tone softened. The urgency did not disappear, it submerged. It usually means recalibration. The aftershock phase revealed who felt the shift first. Regional intermediaries adjusted language. Policy institutes updated briefings, none announced a crisis, yet none spoke as if conditions were unchanged. From then on, the sequence no longer resembled a temporary disturbance, it resembled a transition already in motion. Measured against earlier baselines, the scale becomes clearer. 2 years ago, regional policy tracking groups recorded only a limited cluster of coordinated Sahel security consultations. Recently, that cluster expanded to include roughly half again as many recurring forums, indicating a widening decision network rather than isolated dialogue. That shift signals institutional consolidation. Another indicator concerns tempo. Comparable diplomatic cycles often stretched across several quarters before producing visible adjustments. In the current phase, parallel responses have appeared within weeks. A third metric reflects human impact. Surveys conducted by regional economic observers suggest that in several Sahel-adjacent zones, a noticeable share of small cross-border traders reported altering routes or partners during a single fiscal cycle. Taken together, these 3 data points form a layered picture. First, the decision space widened. Second, reaction time compressed. Third, behavioral effects reached ground level. When those layers move simultaneously, analysts usually classify the situation not as routine fluctuation but as structural transition. This is why references to Ibrahim Traoré often appear alongside broader trend analyses rather than only political commentary. Observers tracking Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso developments therefore tend to interpret his role through context rather than personality, seeing him as positioned within a larger transformation already underway. Numbers alone rarely carry emotional weight. Yet in policy interpretation, Numbers serve another purpose, they anchor perception. And assessment changes how institutions prepare. At that stage, the issue is no longer whether change exists. Serious observers acknowledge that not everyone interprets these developments the same way. Diverging views exist, and some of them are grounded in reasonable arguments. Recognizing those perspectives is essential for understanding the full landscape rather than seeing only one side of it. One widely expressed position holds that the recent shifts are being overstated. Supporters of this view argue that regional dynamics have always fluctuated and that what appears dramatic now may simply reflect normal cycles of diplomatic adjustment. And then stability returns. From that angle, references linking broader regional motion to figures like Ibrahim Traoré may exaggerate individual influence. Yet, when analysts compare the pace, coordination, and multi-sector responses seen recently with earlier cycles, they notice that the current pattern includes synchronized adjustments across several domains at once. That simultaneity is less typical of routine fluctuation and more characteristic of structural change. Another strong counterargument suggests that external commentary is projecting meaning onto events that local actors themselves may see as pragmatic rather than transformative. According to this interpretation, decisions emerging from Sahel governments could simply reflect practical responses to immediate constraints rather than a coordinated strategic pivot. This perspective deserves attention because local realities often tension. However, when observers examine timing sequences, they find that multiple policy signals across different institutions appeared within unusually tight windows. That clustering implies planning rather than coincidence. Since independent reactions rarely align so closely without shared drivers. Placing both interpretations side by side clarifies something important. Neither side is baseless. One emphasizes caution against exaggeration. The other highlights evidence of coordinated motion. When considered together, the picture becomes sharper. The question is not whether change exists, but how deep its roots run and how durable its trajectory may prove. That balanced view allows the situation to be understood with greater precision and less noise. What shifted was not a speech or a statement, but a layer beneath them. Analysts reviewing recent sequences noticed that a previously overlooked factor began appearing across separate briefings. References internal capacity benchmarks tied to regional cooperation timelines. Yet its repetition across unrelated policy discussions suggested it was not incidental. It indicated that planning frameworks were being aligned behind the scenes. This is where interpretation changes. Earlier signals looked like isolated policy moves. With this new element, they resemble pieces of a coordinated template. When observers traced when those references first appeared, they found they coincided with moments when commentary about Ibrahim Traoré intensified in regional analysis circles. The overlap does not prove causation, but timing correlations like that often unmark turning points in geopolitical assessments because they reveal when narratives and planning structures begin reinforcing each other. From that moment onward, reactions shifted tone. Commentators who had described events as temporary adjustments started describing them as indicators. Institutions that once issued routine updates began publishing scenario outlooks. Even the language used in briefings evolved, moving from descriptive phrasing to anticipatory phrasing. That linguistic change matters because bureaucratic language usually shifts only after internal expectations have already changed. The effect is subtle but decisive. When frameworks adjust, decisions that follow are no longer improvised. They are executed. And once execution replaces reaction, the story enters a different phase entirely. The consequences did not stay confined to briefing rooms. They began surfacing in practical layers of reality, where policy translates into pressure, opportunity, or uncertainty depending on who is affected. What appeared abstract at first gradually became tangible. At the state level, decision-makers found themselves navigating tighter margins when signals of coordinated regional repositioning spread. Governments had to reassess existing agreements and contingency plans almost simultaneously. That kind of compressed evaluation cycle can strain administrative systems because policies normally reviewed over long intervals suddenly require rapid validation. Analysts noted that official language grew more cautious, suggesting institutions were recalibrated before committing publicly. That tone shift alone can influence diplomatic confidence. For businesses, the impact emerged through risk perception. Firms operating across borders rely heavily on predictability. When policy trajectories appear to shift, even subtly, companies tend to adjust logistics, financing assumptions, and partnership strategies. Some regional enterprises reportedly began mapping alternative routes or suppliers not because of immediate disruption, but because they anticipated future adjustments. In economic behavior, anticipation can be as powerful as reality. Confirmation later. Among citizens, effects are felt through atmosphere rather than documents. Changes in diplomatic posture can influence expectations about employment, prices, or mobility even before measurable indicators move. Social sentiment analysts frequently watch for this stage because perception shifts often precede statistical shifts. When public conversations begin referencing geopolitical developments in everyday discussions, it signals that macro-level dynamics have reached street-level awareness. Beyond national borders, the regional dimension amplifies everything. Observing shifts associated with figures such as Ibrahim Traoré may adjust their own strategies to avoid being caught off balance. That creates a ripple pattern. One recalibration prompts another, then another, until a chain of precautionary adaptations spreads across multiple countries. In international relations, such ripple effects can reshape alignments without a single formal announcement. By the time these layers become visible simultaneously, the transformation is no longer theoretical. It tends to involve everyone within its radius, whether they initiated it or not. Looking ahead, the most probable path is neither dramatic collapse nor instant transformation, but a gradual tightening of regional coordination combined with periodic moments of tension. If current patterns continue, policy signals linked to environments such as those surrounding Ibrahim Traoré will likely appear in measured intervals rather than sudden bursts, with institutions testing reactions before committing to larger steps. There is also a more optimistic possibility. If emerging cooperation frameworks mature successfully, they could reduce uncertainty and give governments space to align economic and security priorities more efficiently. Under that scenario, what now looks like cautious repositioning might later be recognized as groundwork for stronger regional bargaining power and more internally driven development strategies. Such outcomes depend on sustained coordination and consistent execution rather than rhetoric alone. The most adverse scenario, however, would unfold if misinterpretations or mistrust accumulate faster than cooperation mechanisms. In that case, precautionary moves by one actor could be read as threats by another, triggering cycles of defensive policy shifts. Those cycles rarely begin with confrontation, they usually start with small misunderstandings that compound over time. If that dynamic took hold, even well-intended initiatives could be overshadowed by suspicion. What matters most is not predicting which scenario will occur, but recognizing that all three remain plausible at once. Strategic awareness means preparing for each without assuming any is guaranteed. Foresight is less about certainty and more about readiness. After seeing the broader landscape and the possible paths ahead, the most important question becomes personal rather than geopolitical. What does all of this actually mean for the person watching, listening, and trying to make sense of events that seem distant yet gradually draw closer to daily life? Those who actively follow developments like the discussions surrounding Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso already hold a quiet advantage. Context helps them interpret headlines faster and more accurately, but even informed observers benefit from staying cautious because fast-moving situations can shift direction before consensus forms. The most useful step is simple: keep tracking credible signals and compare them over time rather than reacting to single moments. Another group feels indirect pressure instead. Yet their work, investments, or local markets can still be affected by policy shifts happening far away. Preparation does not mean becoming experts. It means staying attentive enough to notice when changes begin influencing practical conditions such as trade patterns, employment stability, or cost structures. Awareness at the right moment often matters more than expertise too early. There is also a third group that assumes such developments have little relevance to them. That reaction is understandable. Large geopolitical shifts often feel abstract until they intersect with everyday reality. Yet history repeatedly shows that ignoring early signals can leave people reacting late rather than adapting early. Even a basic understanding of the underlying dynamics can reduce that risk. No matter which group someone belongs to, understanding the trajectory of events linked to figures like Ibrahim Traoré is not about choosing sides. It is about recognizing patterns early enough to respond thoughtfully instead of urgently. Solutions cannot remain slogans, they must become actions. For leadership circles, the first priority is clarity of direction. Decision makers in environments influenced by shifts associated with Ibrahim Traoré would need to define measurable objectives within defined time frames rather than broad declarations. That means specifying what policy outcomes should look like within set intervals and tracking progress through visible indicators such as agreement implementation rates or cross-border coordination milestones. Trust increases because observers can verify movement instead of interpreting rhetoric. At the institutional level, organizations and commercial actors carry a different responsibility. They must translate policy signals into operational adjustments early enough to avoid disruption. That includes reviewing supply chains, reassessing regional partnerships, and building contingency pathways before conditions for abrupt reactions. Success for this group is measured not by announcements but by stability, whether operations continue smoothly despite shifting external conditions. For communities and individuals, the path is more practical than political. Awareness should lead to small but deliberate actions taken at the right time. This might mean following reliable regional updates, discussing developments within professional networks, or adjusting expectations about markets and opportunities when credible signals point to change. The measure of progress here is behavioral, whether people respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. A fifth layer can strengthen all the others. Cooperative platforms across regions can share information, compare policy outcomes, and identify early warning indicators together. When coordination improves at that level, misunderstandings decrease and decisions become more predictable. That predictability is often the foundation of long-term stability. Plans alone do not shape outcomes, implementation does, and in periods of transition, the difference between the two determines whether momentum produces progress or uncertainty. It is worth recalling the moment earlier, when that seasoned observer described the briefing room where tone mattered more than announcements. That quiet scene now feels different. It seemed like a subtle shift in emphasis. In hindsight, it resembles the opening note of a longer composition that has gradually unfolded since. Viewers who have followed this journey from the first signal to the present point have, in effect, traveled alongside the story itself. They witnessed how scattered remarks became patterns, how patterns became indicators, and how indicators became evidence of motion beneath the surface. The path from uncertainty to recognition did not happen all at once. It formed step by step, each layer clarifying the one before it. Seen this way, the discussion surrounding Ibrahim Traoré is not merely about a single figure or a single country. And regional evolution can be observed. That perspective transforms the narrative from a sequence of events into a reflection on choices and consequences that extend beyond headlines. Moments like these remind observers that history rarely announces its turning points loudly. It reveals them quietly to those paying attention. Understanding early is power. Moments like this often leave different impressions on different people, and that is part of what makes them meaningful. Some may see a strategic shift. Others may see a natural phase in a long regional evolution. Both reactions are valid because interpretation depends on experience, perspective, and what each observer considers most important. If this story felt worth reflecting on, it may also be worth letting others examine it from their own point of view. Conversations that grow from shared understanding tend to be more thoughtful, more nuanced, and more useful than reactions formed in isolation. Sometimes the most valuable impact of a discussion is simply that it invites more people to think carefully about issues shaping the world around them. So perhaps the most interesting question now is not what conclusion to accept, but what perspective you see that others might be missing. That question alone can open the kind of dialogue where insight expands, assumptions are tested, and understanding deepens collectively.